So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Singer on stage.
Can you guys hear me in the back there? So good? All right, good. And I think my voice projects, but I think they want to record this so that if I embarrass myself, it'll be all over the internet forever. So it'll be fun. I've been traveling through Europe and working with startups in different countries and working with the Czech Invest team here that asked me to come and talk to you guys about some lessons that I've learned as an entrepreneur, as well as some questions around mobile. I've launched several mobile companies in the past. I imagine some of you guys are working on mobile companies. So I threw together some slides, talk about some of the lessons and failures that I've had so that you guys can learn from them and hopefully not make the same mistakes that I have had since they were blazing failures. Happy to share them with you. It's also open forum, so if you have any questions, please raise your hand, ask any question you'd like. Hopefully I'll be able to answer them, especially around mobile. I didn't put too many slides in here because I wasn't sure if everybody is doing a mobile company, so if at the end of this you guys have really different questions, please come up and ask, or during the Q&A and ask. I'll be here also later, so if you guys want to corner me and ask me whatever, I'll be here. All right. So let me talk to you about some of the lessons that I've learned as an entrepreneur, as well as someone who's been teaching entrepreneurship for some time. My background, which is fairly varied, I am actually not an engineer. How many of you guys have been trained as engineers? Okay, good. So I'm not a trained engineer, but I've worked with many of them, and I teach in an engineering department at UC Berkeley. So I run the entrepreneurship center for the engineering school, and Berkeley is quite large, so we have about 5 different incubators / entrepreneurship centers. We do various things for our different audiences. The business school, of course, helps business school students become entrepreneurs, but the engineering school realized while there's lots of innovation and lots of research that comes out of our campus, a lot of our engineers decide not to go and pursue creating their company for some reason. And that's why we created the center, to try to address that issue and hopefully help them become better entrepreneurs. And in that process, I learned some things about why it's difficult for engineers to become entrepreneurs. I know some of you being engineers, you'll have experienced some things that I'm talking about later in this presentation. Also, just getting ahead of myself. So I'm still a little jet lagged. So I was hoping that you guys were going to be able to drink the beer before my presentation, because I'm 10 times more entertaining if you've had at least 1 beer. If you had 2, I am hilarious. So I wish that was happening right now. But well, I guess it's going to be for after. And maybe because I'm so boring, you'll have to drink many beers. So we'll see. So I'm a serial entrepreneur. I've been at this for quite a long time. I started my first company when I was in college. We raised a bunch of money, and we crashed and burned. We like to blame that on the 9/11 event that had happened, and all of the funding and all of the activity that we were involved in just completely died. But and we ended up selling the technology to another company, to a Singaporean company. But I learned a lot from that experience. And one of the things that I learned was that no matter how big the failure was, I could not get it out of my blood. I had to go back and do it again. Apparently it wasn't painful enough for me to learn the lessons, right? And so I kept going back and back and back. And so I've done several. My last one I started 7 years ago and had a German co-founder. So it wasn't tough enough to do my first startup and fail. I had to start a company with a German co-founder, which, by the way, is incredibly difficult. Probably some of you are German. It was an incredible challenge for me, but we were quite successful. So we raised a bunch of money. I pitched to over 100 venture capitalists, which sounds like a lot of people. It is, except for on Sand Hill Road, which is only about 40 minutes from where I live, there are about 150 different firms just along a 1-mile stretch. So it's fairly easy to meet as many people as possible who have a lot of money. I've also raised lots of angel money for various companies that I've either consulted for or started myself. And where I really focus is where the enterprise meets mobility. So if you have an enterprise mobility solution, I'd be happy to help you not make the mistakes that I made. Right? And I've also mentored and advised lots and lots of companies throughout the world, again, around lessons that I've learned. So before I get into kind of the meat of the presentation, I'd like to ask you guys if you know what this animal is.
Raven.
Raven, yeah. So raven or crow, they're part of the same family. Do you guys know what they're famous for?
They are not stupid.
Sorry?
They are not stupid.
They are not stupid. That is correct. They are considered one of the most intelligent animals on the planet. They are so intelligent that they've had to rewrite biology books over and over because they keep creeping up the list as being as intelligent, almost as intelligent as primates. And they've been observed without being trained, dropping nuts in front of moving vehicles so that the vehicle will break it open so they can get inside the nut. They've been also observed flying in front of vehicles just to watch it swerve. There's no other purpose but for entertainment. These crows would just fly in front of a vehicle to see if they can make the vehicle move. So on some level, they're also kind of evil, right? Because that's a weird thing for an animal to be able to do. But in terms of tools, they have been observed in the wild as well as in laboratories using things like this to pull food out of crevices that its feet couldn't reach. And again, this is not through training, this is just through somehow knowing how to do this. They've also seen crows, they've done studies and they've shown that crows transfer information generationally. So they can teach their children how to use tools. They can teach them information that actually passes down multiple generations. So imagine that, right? An animal being able to transfer information through generations. That's a really advanced thing. What they've also been observed doing is making their own tools. So if you see this exercise, right? There's food in this box. Its beak can't reach the food. It sees this long stick that could probably reach that food, but it can't reach it because of this contraption. It sees this little stick. If he pulls the little stick out, the stick's not long enough to get the food, but it can pull the long stick out and use the long stick to get the food out of that thing. Now it's so complicated, it's hard for me to even describe this. And there's a video of a 7-step process that a crow does, in which if he does one step in the wrong order, he can't reach the food. And in this video, he does it beautifully. He just watches to see what steps he has to do and then executes it. The reason I bring this up is because I have students at UC Berkeley, really good university, that cannot do this. They literally cannot make their own tools. Because for their entire academic career, they have been given tools to use. Formulas, instructions, all the things that they'll need to use to find the answer, to get the right answer, right? But they've never really been challenged to make their own tools. And I'm sure many of you guys have gone through formal education where that's kind of the case, because at the end they just test you for retention of knowledge. And based on how well you do that, how fast you do that, right, you get into the best school, and then they do more of that to you, until at the end, you're really good at solving problems that other people have shown you exist with tools they tell you to use. What's kind of ironic is that we're actually inductive learners. We learn exactly the opposite of the way that we've been taught. We look at something and we see the result, and we try to find out why that result exists. Think about anything in your life. You see like a car accident, and the first thing you're thinking is, well, other than did someone die, which is probably your first thought, if something hurt, what caused that? What happened there, right? Our brains are structured to look at information and find the cause of that. This is why murder mysteries are the most popular TV shows in the US. Everybody's trying to figure out the answer before the show tells you what the answer is. And that's because our brains are wired to do that, right? And the reason I bring this up is because if, as university students, we are taught to think in one way, this deductive way, we're given rules, we're given formulas, we're given all the things that we need to know how to do, and then we're thrown into the entrepreneurship world, you're going to get everything wrong. I'll show you why. So when it comes to students, In terms of risk and reward, they don't want to look dumb in front of their professor or in front of their fellow students, so they don't raise their hands. They're reluctant. And I see in some cultures, most people will sit in the back row. They don't want to sit in the front row because they don't want to bring attention to themselves. I don't know if the Czech culture is that way, but in France, it's everyone. It's like you could just watch it. The back row fills up, and then the next row fills up, and the next row fills up, and then everyone stands in the back because no one wants to sit in the front row, right? No one wants to bring attention to themselves. But in startup land, you have to risk being wrong because you're trying to figure out what's going on, right? What your startup, where your customers are, and you might find that your customers don't exist. You might fail, right? In terms of culture, students are taught to be perfect, especially engineering students, because if you don't do it right, the plane falls out of the sky, the train crashes, and the world ends, right? Because you have to be perfect. In startup land, you have to focus on being just good enough. Because if you wait for perfection, Google will beat you. That is just a rule of life. You have to just do it just enough so you can compete against the big boys. With collaboration, students, the smart ones, think they should know the answer before the professor even asks the question. That's the definition of being smart. You know the answer, right? But in startup land, you have to go ask for help. That's just part of it. You have to raise your hand because it may take too long for you to solve that problem on your own, especially if you don't have, the context on how to solve that problem. Also, students are tested individually. I don't know, how many of you guys have had a test, you've been tested as a group in school? Some of you guys have? Okay, I'm starting to see that a lot now too, is that there's several people, especially if you go to business school, they're starting to test in groups. But mostly, and I work a lot in France, they're not only tested individually, they know what score they got against all other students in the country that year, right? So you're tested individually, and then you're scored individually, and you know where you stack against other people. But in startup land, you're rewarded as a team. It doesn't matter if you ace it, right? No matter whether your code completely compiles, if your teammate cannot sell it, you all fail. It's a completely different feeling of not being in control of your own A, right? And students, they see everybody as a competitor because only one person can get the best grade in the class. With startups, everyone is a resource. In my last company, I knew the CEO of every one of my competitors, and I would have a conversation with them at least once or twice a year at conferences, and we would talk about deals that we might have lost to each other, right? But that's kind of the culture in the Valley, is that even your competitors are somewhat your partners, because if you're all startups, you're all fighting the same fight against, yet again, Google, right? There's a common theme here. And many of you guys are up against the same foe. So when you're a student, this is what you've been taught. You've been taught to think this way. This is the mentality, this is the mindset that you have been given to go out into the world. But if you then go from here to becoming a startup person, you have it absolutely backwards. You're going to hoard information. You're not going to collaborate. You're going to try to wait for perfection because you don't want anyone to see it until it's perfect, because you'd be embarrassed if it breaks, right? So my point here is that if you've been trained as an engineer or as a student in any university, you have been trained to not be an entrepreneur. This is why you might find it difficult as you start your company. Lots of things feel foreign, feels difficult. You don't understand why things aren't working. It's because you have been taught to think the opposite. And so this is why at Berkeley we teach students this reality, and we try to pop them out and say, even if you're the best student, in fact, the best students that go on to PhDs, we have found they're the ones who are the least likely to become good entrepreneurs. They have a difficult time adjusting because they've been given 18 or 19 years of this kind of thinking, right? So I wanted to give you that background because now as you guys go into entrepreneurship, I learned all of this stuff by Braille. I hit every wall, I missed every lesson, I failed at all of these things and ultimately figured out what was going on just by hitting these walls on my own. So hopefully you guys can learn from some of these things. And one of the lessons I learned, trying to break out from the student mentality that I've been taught in, is that you need help from everyone, right? From your employees, obviously, and your co-founders, but also from your investors. Your investors in your first, if you're a team of 5, you've got a few investors, they're actually your extended team. They're people who can get you customers. They're people who can, talk to your competitors without your competitors knowing that you're talking to them, right? They play that role. And then customers also become part of your team too, because they're the ones who are helping you design your product. They're part of your team, and you can learn a lot from them. And of course, your competitors, you learn an enormous amount. If you're a small company, I imagine most of your budget goes to development of your product, right? But what's going to make it successful is the right kind of marketing. And you don't have that big of a budget. So if you have 5 competitors in a market that's starting from scratch, it's a brand new thing. Everyone's trying to tell the world that this is something that's important. If you bundle all of your marketing budgets together, you now have a decent marketing budget. And that's what we did in my last company, is that almost all of our competitors were using the same language to describe the problems and the solutions that were available to customers. And you started hearing customers parrot back all the things that we had been talking about as a group of competitors. So everyone here provides you help. And that's one lesson that I learned, that you've got to be willing to share in order to get that help. The other lesson I learned in this kind of area is that everyone and everything is an opportunity to learn. Every single person is a lesson. It's a teachable moment. Every relationship you have, every point of contact, everything that you experience, whether it's a success or fail, and especially the failures are the ones that are great learning experiences, because you are obsessed at figuring out why that went wrong. So you'll spend a lot of time trying to figure it out, and you'll learn lots of things from that. But of course, this is a lesson you can apply to life too. So if you have failures in life, relationships, or whatever, I'm not going to get into your personal lives, but that's a really good way of looking at it too, is that you can learn from every experience. Another lesson that I learned is that listening is your most important and powerful tool. And as someone who's been, been trained to think that I have to have all the right answers, I was when someone talks to you as someone, if you think you're smart, you're wanting to jump in and let them know, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. Oh yeah, I know where you're going with that, right? Problem is, when you do that, you might be missing a point that they're going to give you at the end of that sentence. So you want to resist the impulse to try to say, oh yeah, I can finish your sentence. I know where you're going with that thought. So listening is really key. Another lesson is that different personalities communicate differently, and this is where I learned, working with my German co-founder, is that my logic is not his logic. Something that makes sense to me did not make sense to him. And it doesn't mean that he's stupid or wrong. It just means that I had to somehow translate it into a language that he learned, or that he understands, right? And many of you guys might have worked with teams in the US or in Germany as outsourcing teams or whatever, and you might have had that moment going, I thought I was speaking English, but they're responding to a completely different thought. What happened there, right? And what I've had to do is learn how to communicate across that and resist the initial thought of, my God, this person is an idiot. Because oftentimes it's not that, it's the communication, and that you weren't good at articulating what you wanted to be understood. Another thing, brutal honesty. Okay, so I'm sure you guys have run into this situation, this picture. Someone has their fly open, right? I think this is a great metaphor, because you don't want the guy to be embarrassed that he's walking around with his fly open, but you kind of don't want to tell him that you've been staring at his fly, right? So at some point you either have to make a choice, am I going to let this person embarrass themselves, or am I going to point out that I've been looking at their junk, right? And that's you're battling that. That's a good metaphor for what you're doing on a team. If you see someone making a mistake, or you think something's going the wrong direction, part of you doesn't want to raise your hand because you don't want to embarrass the person, or maybe it's your boss and you don't want to risk losing your job, right? But then you also calculate, wow, that's a huge, epic, expensive mistake. If I let this person do this, it's going to be a problem for everybody, right? And I'm sure you guys have all wrangled with that, with bosses that didn't make the right decision or didn't have enough information to make the right decision, struggle with that. Think of this image the next time you struggle with that, right? But that's one of the things that I learned, is that brutal honesty is a business strategy. You have to create an environment in your team that respects honesty. One culture that really does that, I think more than any culture I've ever run into, is the Israeli culture. If you guys have ever worked with Israelis, brutal honesty is just part of the culture, and they will just say stuff to you, super personal, and you think, wow, that's really random, but it's part of what was part of their culture. And if you see some of the companies that come out of Israel, you can see that might have a positive impact, is that they're preventing each other from making mistakes because they're pointing them out. Another lesson: timing is everything. So we had a pretty decent exit, that we sold 2 years ago. I had a fairly good, boost at the end there, but well compensated. But it was timing. We sold our company, I would say, at the right time. Our competitors sold before us, and they made 10 times more than we did, so their timing was even better. Timing is enormously important, which you can't necessarily have any control over. A market grows or hits the news right at the right time. I wish I had done WhatsApp, because there's 19 billion reasons why that was awesome. But who knew, right? I mean, that's because there are like 20 other apps just like it, and who knew that was going to happen? And so luck is another element of that. You just sometimes are lucky. And I would say most startups that have had good exits had an element of both of these things. And notice there's no skill here, right? Skill is something necessary to get to a certain point, but it's not sufficient to win. You need these two things on your side as well. Another lesson is your story is your product. If you cannot tell a good story about what you do, why you're doing it, what your product does, and why your team is working 24/7 to do it, you don't have a product because you can't sell it. You can't tell your story. That's what people want to hear. They want to understand what it is and why it's important. And so your story's got to be quick and powerful, but it also has to be provocative too. Right? This is I know this is the wrong audience. It's American football, so I might have to explain this. This is semi-illegal. But usually never caught because it's done in a way that you're not going to get caught. So your story has to be memorable in some way that people will see. Wow, this is something that I need to remember. Okay? Also, another lesson: you got to be creative in all parts of your business, not just on your product. You have to find clever ways to get paid. Worst thing about customers is a lot of them don't like paying you. Even after you've delivered your product and they say they're happy, they find ways to not pay you on time and drag it out. It's kind of, I think, a national pastime in America to do that. But you have to find clever ways to make all of your business work. Prioritization. I would say that most companies die because of this. They fail to know what things they should be doing when. Because most people can't tell the difference between progress and activity. They feel like, oh, I'm doing all this work. This is all, I'm so busy. I'm doing all this stuff. And what all they're doing is running in circles, making their product look a little bit prettier, maybe a little more functional, maybe on all these other platforms, yet they've got one customer or one user on the platform they've built. They're not prioritizing properly. So if you know how to prioritize and know which decisions need to be made when, you will most likely be somewhat successful. You'll at least be able to sell your company. If you can't do this, this will be a disaster in your startup, big company you work for, personal life, all that kind of stuff. So prioritization is an incredible skill that I continue to learn. Like, I'm not the best at prioritization, and I'm still getting better at it. Another lesson is, I love doing strategy. I love talking about where a product can be, what customers could get out of it. But unless you execute it, it's nothing. It is completely a masturbatory exercise to come up with a strategy if you don't execute it. So if your team is really good at getting things done, focus on getting things done, right? Because ultimately you'll find a strategy that works for you, and you'll probably just stumble on it. Choose your team wisely. It is really tough to fire your best friend, which I ended up having to do. That was a really tough lesson. You work really hard, and then people develop at different speeds. Sometimes the company grows really fast, and everyone kind of paces with it and grows and matures with it. And then you have people who just can't grow with it. They're just, they're stuck in that old way of doing things. They're not willing to learn, and they don't grow, and so you end up having to fire them. It's really painful and really toxic to a team to have a lot of churn. So pick the people that you want really, really carefully. And this is a lesson I continue to learn, because you don't always know how good people are, and sometimes they fail. I'm going to stress this again. Your team is your competitive edge. If you can't rely on your team, if you can't trust your team to deliver, this will be a really big problem as you grow. Because what ends up happening is you add new people who might be super competent, but then they see the old people not working as hard or aren't as competent. Those old people don't get more competent. The new people stop working hard. Right? And that's almost, you see that all over the place. They do lots of research on this, and they've found that has that negative impact. Right? So make sure that you keep your team really strong. Diversity is active survival. And I don't mean diversity by ethnic diversity, because I don't see many non-white people here, because I guess this is Eastern Europe. I was in Lithuania actually earlier this week, and that place is even more white, so I'm just pointing this out. And I'm on the plane to go to Lithuania, and I see this other Asian guy on the plane coming on, and we stare at each other going, what are you doing on this plane, right? Because it's like you run into the one other person who is there. What I mean by diversity is diversity of skill. So having your entire team really awesome at one thing, if that one thing no longer is valuable, you're screwed, right? If everyone's great at coding but no one can sell, you're screwed, right? So you need to have people who think differently, who know different skills, who are going to push you in different directions. It might be painful because you get in arguments because you're different people, you have different opinions. But that actually is how you find the solutions, is people knocking into each other and bringing different perspectives. So I can't stress this enough. And the metaphor here is, if you know rowing, you have a bunch of tall people rowing, and then you have this really short person, it's a light person who's yelling at them to row faster and in a certain kind of pace, right? And the reason why is we want that person to be light, right? So you have to have different skills and different makeup of people to be successful. This one is tough if you have been told you can never fail. This one is tough for me. You gotta take risks. Everyone tells you about this. This is kind of like almost a cliche to take these risks. Everyone says, go do this, and you're like, well, what do you mean by that? I mean, I do that every day. But the result of that can be like this. So taking the risk, you have to be willing to accept the possibility of failure and the willingness to learn from it. I have done that many times in many different ways. I'll give you an example. One of the things that I hate doing is fundraising. Even though if you're a CEO of a startup, that's basically what you need to do, because your primary job is to make sure the company doesn't run out of money. So have to do that all the time. But my greatest fundraising fail is that I didn't ask for the check when I should have. This was back when people were just cutting checks in meetings, literally like a $250,000 check. And my third meeting with this one investor, I was like, totally going to get the check, he's going to cut it for me. And then for some reason, I just couldn't get myself to ask for it. Asking for money can be difficult, right? Please give me $250,000 in a personal check right now. Like, how do you ask that question? It's just very difficult. So I had to wait till the 5th meeting at his house, and I'm going through the update again, which he's seen already, but this is just yet another kind of spin on it. I'm going through it, I'm like, I'm totally nailing this, this is awesome, I'm in my groove. And then he stops me and he goes, there's 2 of you. And my co-founder sitting there, I'm like, yeah, there's 2 of us. You're killing my groove right now. I'm like about to ask you for the check. And he goes, no, there's 2 of you. And then he proceeded to tell me a story about 10 years prior, where he was with his daughter and he had the same experience and went to the hospital, and turned out he had a mini stroke. And that's exactly what he was experiencing at that moment. he was, imagine this, like I'm going to ask for a big ass check and the guy has a stroke on you, right? And the first thought, because apparently part of me is quite evil, is do you think he's still able to write a check, even though he can't see straight, right? That's what's going through my head. And so he gets better and he sends us flowers. Thank you for helping us or whatever, for helping me and all this. But he wouldn't return our phone calls because he was so embarrassed by the event. That he never knew I was going to continue to tell this story to the world. I tell this story to a lot of people. I've got a lot of mileage for this story, but he refused to answer the door. I mean, we went to his house, to say, hey, how are you doing? And can we have our check, right? But he would never return our calls. And for personal reasons, he was just so embarrassed to even see us. So the lesson that I learned was you have to ask for money when it's the time to ask for money. Don't wait too long for the guy to have a stroke on you. So don't be that guy that your investor strokes out on you. He's okay now, by the way. He's fine. All right? There's a happy story, at least for him, not for us. Another lesson is this one. How many of you guys are the CEO of your startup? How many of you guys agree with this statement, that it is a very, very lonely job? Okay, because for the rest of you, there is information that we have that we always carry around that we cannot share with you, right? How much money do we have? How likely are we going to get funded? When are we going to run out of money? Who's a toxic person in the team that we've got to somehow get rid of? What's going on with our advisors or our investors? With our competitors, what's going on? Are we getting sued? Like I got a threat from Apple one time about a lawsuit, right? That we were somehow violating a copyright, even though we had been using that word in our material a year before they were even using it. So, and you can't tell everybody, oh yeah, we might possibly be getting sued by Apple, right? There's just information you can't share, and it is incredibly lonely holding that information in, right? So you have to be prepared for that if you're going to go into this job, is that there's some things you're looking into the abyss and there's no one to share that information with. And that's why you should have some advisors around who's willing to listen to you. But even then, there's some information like you're freaking out that you might not be able to make this work. Right? Everyone has those doubts, but you can't share it with your team because that will freak them out. So that's it for the lessons that I learned, but one of the topics that they had asked me to cover was on scaling the business. What's the difference between what you're doing now and maybe scaling the business into thousands of customers? The one lesson that I learned from that is that you have to take a completely different approach. And if you're familiar with the high jump, this is the way that people do the high jump now, but this wasn't always the way to do it. Before, people jumped over it face first. And someone came along and said, I can't jump any higher than what's being jumped today, but if I jump backwards, I can get an extra foot. Right? They had to completely change their approach, different stance, and tilt their body in a completely different way. That's what you're going to have to do if you're going to scale. The people, the processes, the thinking may not be sufficient for the scaling that you're about to embark on, and you may need to replace all of those things, and it is incredibly painful. But that is something that you might have to do. And it's scary because so much of the other stuff worked for you in the early parts of growing the company. You're afraid of throwing all that away and doing something completely different that might completely fail. And that's one of the things that I learned on growing the business. Another thing about venture funding, how many of you guys are raising VC money right now? Okay, how's it going? How are the VCs in the Czech Republic? Are they painful? Painful. Well, unfortunately, they're painful everywhere, it turns out. Just there's a lot more of them in the valley, which is good and bad because they talk to each other too. So as you go to talk to one VC, talk to another one, the other one might already be aware of you, and sometimes they collude and sometimes they fight for your deals. So there's a lot of information going on behind your back as you're fundraising. So be cognizant of that. I use this slide to kind of give you what the way that they look at this game, right? A lot of them look at it as a numbers game. They've got a certain amount of money, they've got to invest in companies, and they have to take a certain strategy, because what they have done is they've gone to Wall Street or to investors and say, hey, we want to do a venture fund, and we have this particular strategy in investing. We're looking for just mobile companies, or we're looking for just SaaS companies, or we're looking for companies that have proven certain sales cycles and a certain amount of revenue within enterprises, and that's who we're going to invest in. Right? They'll go and they'll give their investment strategy, and investors will invest based on that. And so a lot of times they're restricted in what they can invest in because they made promises to their investors. So if you get a no from an investor saying, I don't want to meet you, it might just be because you don't fit their investment strategy. Okay, so don't take it personally, it just sometimes you don't fit. A lot of them will tell you, we invest in teams. We look for really strong, capable teams, and we invest in them, and we think they'll somehow find the right model, right? To some degree, that's true. And I've seen very few investors who will just invest in a team because they think they'll pull it off. And one of the examples is Groupon. They're VCs, it's well documented. It said, we don't really think the business is there. Frankly, the previous version of Groupon, the first iteration of the idea, but they're like, we think these guys are going to pivot into something that will work, and that's exactly what they did. But very few investors do it that way. Most investors look at the world like this. So think about the market as the river, your product is this raft here, and your team are people who are paddling in this raft. Okay? Now, if your team doesn't work out, an investor is going to think, oh, well, we can just replace the team. We can just get a whole new team. If they fail, we'll just put new, more competent rowers in there. Right? If your product doesn't work out, they're like, oh, well, we can have the team build a whole new raft. That's fine, we'll just happen to do that. But if you don't have a market, right, there's no water, you can't conjure up a river. You just can't make one up, right? So the baseline thing that I've seen almost every VC do is they calculate how big your market is. How real is it? Is it something that can be tapped? And if it's not, then no matter how good your team is or how good your product is, they just won't talk to you or won't go very far in your conversation. So you really need to know your market in a way that will get them excited, and that's real, right? So if I were to give you one piece of advice about when you go VC hunting, you need to know your numbers really, really well. You need to know, how much is IBM getting out of this market? How much is, Google getting out of this market? You really need to know this stuff because they will ask you, and then if they believe in what you say over time, they'll develop a relationship with you. They'll come to you for information. You become the expert to them, right? But that's really key, is you have to have that nailed. I love this slide. It's so awesome. There's something about a unicorn, and I think it's anatomically correct, so that's why I covered it. I have to show these slides in the Middle East, and I don't want to get kicked out of the countries. On fundraising, scarcity and urgency. So some of you guys are fundraising. Okay, so here's kind of the dirty secret. VCs are human, and they might not seem like it, because some of them are massive assholes. But for the most part, they are human, and they are driven by human things. In particular, fear and greed. Okay? Those are the two things that just generally drive their decision making. With greed, of course, they want to get the next WhatsApp. They want the next Facebook. They want the next Google. They want a huge exit because they've got to pay back their investors, their investment. But the other thing that drives them is the fear of losing the deal. Fear that Sequoia is going to get the deal, or that Kleiner is going to get the deal. And so oftentimes they can be coerced into jumping into a deal, giving you better terms, moving quickly, if they know other people are interested. This is very much like dating. So if I have to qualify this statement, because I've done this presentation in front of young engineers at universities, and many of whom don't know what dating is. Imagine, if you want to establish a relationship with someone where they're going to give you $5 million, right? After meeting them for 5 meetings, right? Imagine that, getting a $5 million check after just meeting them 5 times. And in the dating metaphor, right? Imagine getting married after having five meetings, right? 5 dates. This, by the way, this metaphor works everywhere except for India, where I've done this, and I said, imagine getting married after 5 meetings, and everyone's like, I didn't even know the person before I married them, right? Because it was arranged. So this does not apply for every culture. I just want to point that out. But imagine that, like in Czech Republic, I imagine you guys, check out the merchandise before you buy, right? Bad metaphor. We'll edit that one out. But you also want to know that other people want it, right? That there's competition. And when I raised money for my last company, we struggled for like 4 months. Again, it was early days, so the market wasn't talking about this type of solution until probably 2 months before we got funding. And suddenly, all these VCs started popping up and wanting meetings and asking about what we're doing. And then we had about 3 VCs starting to vie for the deal. And things moved incredibly fast. We got a term sheet, and then we got another term sheet, and this all happened within days. And then they started negotiating to get the other firm not included in the deal, because we wanted to syndicate it. And the one firm gave us incredible terms, amazing valuation, and said, as long as you don't let this other VC into the deal, we want the whole deal, right? So they sensed that others were wanting this deal badly, and we told them we only had room for about $5 million in investment, and that we were only interested in getting 2 VCs in there. One said, hell, we'll take the whole thing, so there's nothing left for the other guy, so there's scarcity. And they also knew there's a time bomb there, that we're going to have to say yes to somebody, and the other person's going to be out. So I was fielding calls, rather than calling VCs every day trying to get meetings. I was getting like 3 or 4 calls from each of these partners saying, hey, are we there yet? Are we there yet? And at some point, you got to tell someone you're not going to marry them, which is awkward at best. So use these tactics, right? Scarcity and urgency to say, hey, we're raising $700,000. We've got a few $100,000 already committed. We're getting close to getting the rest of it closed, and we're just circling around with the people that we want in this deal and giving you guys a shot at getting in, right? Instead of going, we really need money. Can you give us money, right? Dad, can I get more allowance money? That posture doesn't work. You have to go in and say, like, hey, you're going to miss out on this. This is about to go. And you don't want to be arrogant about it, but you want to point out, hey, this is going to be a big exit at some point, and we're just giving you an opportunity to play with us. Right? All right, so that's it. You guys have any questions or?